At 10:47 that night, my sister called before I could say hello. "How could you do this to your own family?" Heather screamed. Her voice shook so hard that I almost did not recognize it. In the background, a man asked why Monday's transfer had been flagged for review. A drawer slammed. Someone said the compliance office would call in the morning. Then the line went quiet. 6 hours earlier, my 10-year-old daughter had been sitting alone at our family barbecue. Lucy held a paper plate on her knees, while my sister's children chased one another across the yard. Beside her sat the strawberry cake she had baked that morning. It leaned slightly to the left, but Lucy had insisted it was not crooked. It had personality. I crouched beside her. "Why aren't you playing with Chloe and Ben?" Lucy kept her eyes on the grass. "Kids with dads play together." For a second, I thought I had misheard her. "Who said that?" Heather walked over before Lucy could answer, wearing the calm smile she used whenever she wanted cruelty to sound reasonable. "We all agreed on it," she said. "The children need healthy boundaries." I looked around the yard. My mother studied the food table. My father adjusted the grill. My brother suddenly found his phone fascinating. Not one person met my eyes. Chloe stood near the swing set with tears in her eyes, and Lucy had one hand closed tightly around something in her lap. I picked up the leaning cake and said, "Understood." Then we left, without saying goodbye. Halfway home, Lucy opened her fist. Inside was a folded note and a photograph of a bank statement bearing her name. It showed a transfer scheduled for Monday to Pierce Family Events LLC. Taped to the back was a phone number and 4 words in Chloe's handwriting. "Your dad never stopped." I called from my parked car. A man answered on the 3rd ring and said my name, like he had been waiting 8 years to say it. "Samantha? It's Daniel. Did Lucy finally get my letters?" The bank would not discuss the account with me, but it accepted a fraud complaint and flagged the pending transfer for manual review. Daniel sent 8 years of deposit records, returned letters, and emails I had never written. My brother texted one sentence: "Do not delete the family chat." By the time Heather called, an attorney was preparing a preservation notice for Monday morning, and I was holding the scan of a birthday card my daughter had never been allowed to see. "How could you do this to your own family?" she repeated. I looked at Lucy asleep on the sofa, the image of Daniel's card beside her hand. "I haven't done anything yet," I said. "Stay with me to learn why my family needed Lucy to believe her father had abandoned her, and subscribe to the channel for more stories where buried truths finally come to light." That Sunday began with strawberry frosting on the kitchen cabinet, flour on Lucy's nose, and a cake that seemed determined to escape its own plate. Lucy stood on a chair beside the counter, holding a spatula with the concentration of a surgeon. The bottom layer had cooled unevenly, and the top one kept sliding toward the window. I reached for a knife to straighten it. She blocked me with the spatula. "Do not touch her." "Hea?" "The cake. She is not crooked. She has personality." I studied the pink tower leaning several degrees to the left. Her personality may require structural support. Lucy pressed 2 strawberries into the frosting. "Perfect cakes are suspicious. This one looks honest." I found a cardboard box large enough to keep our honest cake upright in the car. We were taking it to my parents' Sunday barbecue, one of those gatherings Heather called casual before assigning dishes, games, and a time for photographs. As I taped the box shut, Lucy peered into the refrigerator. "Grandma is making potato salad, right?" She said she was. "Should I bring a fork or a construction permit?" "Bring both. We may have to excavate the eggs." Lucy grinned, and for a few minutes, the day felt easy. That was why I kept taking her to family gatherings, even when I knew better. She loved Chloe and Ben, and spoke about the 3 of them as if being cousins guaranteed belonging. Daniel and I had separated when Lucy was 2. There had been no formal custody order and no court-ordered child support, only exhaustion and fear while I recovered from emergency surgery. For several months, Lucy and I lived with my parents because I could barely lift her, much less manage work, rent, and childcare alone. My mother told me Daniel was unstable. Heather warned that if I opened a support case, he would demand custody and take Lucy to Oregon. She showed me emails that appeared to come from him, cold messages about lawyers and visitation. I understood payroll orders through my job, but understanding a process was not the same as feeling safe enough to begin one. I was dependent on my family and terrified of losing my daughter. So, I stayed silent, then became ashamed of that silence, which made it harder to question later. While I carried the cake to the car, Lucy followed with 2 containers. "Do you think Dad knows my birthday is next month?" She tried to sound casual, but watched my face. "I honestly don't know," I said. I had never called Daniel heartless in front of her. I had only said we had lost contact and that none of it was her fault. She fastened her seatbelt. "Maybe he is terrible with calendars." "Maybe," I said, because hope was kinder than pretending certainty. My parents' backyard was already full when we arrived. Thomas stood at the grill. Susan guarded the buffet, and Heather moved through the yard correcting everything that did not match the picture in her head. She shifted bowls, sent Scott for matching napkins, and told Ben not to start the water balloons until after the full family picture. Even the lawn chairs had been arranged by branch of the family. Brian, my older brother, stood near the patio door with his phone in his hand. He was operations manager for Pierce Family Events, the company my parents had built. When I greeted him, he looked up long enough to say, "Hey, Sam," then dropped his eyes back to the screen. Heather saw the cake and frowned. "We already have dessert. Lucy made this one." "That is sweet. Put it on the side table. We need everyone by the maple tree before the light changes." Chloe spotted Lucy and started across the lawn with both arms open, but Heather stepped between them and rested a firm hand on Chloe's shoulder. "Picture first," she said. Then she turned to Lucy. "Honey, could you get the extra napkins from the kitchen?" By the time Lucy returned, Heather had arranged my parents, Brian, Scott, Chloe, and Ben, beneath the tree. "Perfect," Heather said. Full family picture." Lucy stopped beside me, still holding the napkins. Before I could object, Heather asked her to place them on the food table. The camera clicked while Lucy's back was turned. A few minutes later, Ben ran past carrying a blue plastic bird from the swing set. "Chloe said Bluebird is not a game," he announced. Chloe's face changed. She knocked her cup from the table, splashing lemonade across the patio. Heather spun toward her. Susan grabbed towels, and everyone began talking at once. I assumed Bluebird was a private game. Still, Chloe was not watching the spilled drink. She was watching Heather. The afternoon continued in carefully managed pieces. Heather chose teams, moved children between tables, and remained between Lucy and Chloe whenever they came close. Brian checked his phone constantly. My parents avoided my eyes each time Heather redirected Lucy. Near the end of the meal, I went looking for my daughter. Her cake was still unopened on the side table. Lucy sat alone on a folding chair beside the fence, a paper plate balanced on her knees, while Chloe and Ben played across the yard. I sat beside her. "Why aren't you playing with them?" Lucy stared at the grass for several seconds before answering. "Kids with dads play together." The words landed so quietly that the sounds of the barbecue kept moving around them. Laughter rose from the lawn. Metal tongs clicked against the grill. Someone opened a cooler behind me. I kept my voice low. "Who said that?" Lucy's fingers tightened around her paper plate. Before she could answer, Heather crossed the yard toward us. She wore the soft smile she used whenever she wanted cruelty to sound reasonable. "There you are. I was wondering where you two went." I stood. "Lucy says she was told that kids with dads play together." Heather did not look surprised. She glanced toward Chloe and Ben, then back at me. We all agreed on it. The sentence sounded like a reminder about a dress code. Agreed on what? That the children need healthy boundaries. Heather leaned closer. "Lucy has become a little obsessed with fathers lately. She asks Chloe questions and makes comments. It is uncomfortable for the other children. I looked past her. My mother rearranged serving spoons that did not need rearranging. My father stared into the grill, although the burners were off. Scott lifted a trash bag and began collecting cups from a table still being used. Brian stood near the patio door, with his face fixed on his phone. No one objected. No one even pretended not to understand. This had not begun with a careless sentence from one child. The adults had discussed it, chosen the words, and allowed my daughter to sit alone while they watched. "Did Lucy hurt anyone?" I asked. Heather sighed as if I were forcing her to say something unkind. "No one is accusing her of hurting anyone. She simply does not understand that children from stable homes should not have to carry her confusion." My hand went cold around the folding chair. Lucy had spent years learning not to ask why her father never called. She had accepted every careful answer I gave her and never blamed another child for having what she did not. Now Heather described her grief as if it were contagious. I wanted to ask my mother when she had agreed to this. I wanted Brian to lift his eyes. I wanted my father to explain what kind of boundary required humiliating a 10-year-old. Then I saw Lucy's closed fist. Her nails pressed into her palm. Her lower lip trembled once before she caught it between her teeth. She was trying not to cry because adults disliked being confronted with the consequences of their own cruelty. If I shouted, Heather would turn the scene into evidence that Lucy and I were unstable. My family had spent years teaching me that any strong reaction could be used against me. I picked up the cake box. "Understood," I said. Heather blinked. She had prepared for an argument, not an exit. "Sam, do not be dramatic. No one asked you to leave. You made that unnecessary." I took Lucy's plate, set it beside the unopened cake, and held out my hand. She stood without looking at anyone. My mother finally moved toward us. "Samantha, Heather is only trying to keep the peace." I lifted the cake box. "Then she can enjoy it." We walked through the side gate. Behind us, no one called Lucy back. For the first 10 minutes of the drive, she stared through the passenger window. I did not question her. The air conditioner hummed, and the strawberry cake slid against its cardboard brace whenever I turned. At a red light, Lucy said, "Are you mad at me?" I pulled into the lot of a closed pharmacy and turned off the engine. "Why would I be mad at you?" "Because Chloe gave me something about grown-up money. She said I had to keep it hidden until we left." Her fist opened slowly. Inside was a folded note and a photograph printed on ordinary paper. The image showed part of a bank statement. Lucy's full name appeared near the top. Below, it was a transfer scheduled for Monday to Pierce Family Events LLC, my parents' company. On the back, in uneven blue handwriting, Chloe had written a phone number and 4 words. "Your dad never stopped." I read the sentence twice. "Did Chloe tell you what this means?" Lucy shook her head. "She said Bluebird was not a game. She said her mom would be really mad if she knew I had this." The fear in her voice pushed my shock aside. "You did the right thing by showing me. But it is grown-up stuff. Children are not responsible for keeping secrets that make them scared." Her shoulders lowered. "Is that really my account?" "I do not know yet." "Did Dad put money in it?" "I do not know that either." She watched me carefully. "Are you going to call the number?" "Yes, but you do not have to talk to anyone." I stepped outside, so she would not have to hear the first conversation. My hands shook as I entered the number. A man answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello?" For several seconds, I could not speak. "This is Samantha Pierce." The line went silent. Then he breathed my name as if it hurt. "Samantha? Is this Daniel Brooks?" "Yes." His voice changed immediately. "Is Lucy all right?" The question was too fast and instinctive to sound rehearsed. "She is safe. I have a photograph of a bank statement with her name on it. Your number was written on the back." Another silence followed, stunned rather than guarded. "Did she finally get my letters?" I leaned against the car. "What letters?" Daniel exhaled sharply. The birthday letters, the cards, the school money. I sent everything through your mother because your email said direct contact upset Lucy. I never sent you those emails. He did not argue. Then someone has been writing to both of us. Through the windshield, Lucy sat with Chloe's note on her knees, watching me. Daniel confirmed my email address. Messages began arriving before we reached home. Deposit confirmations, scans of envelopes marked return to sender, photographs of birthday cards, emails carrying my name, but not my voice. One line read, "If you contact Lucy again, I will make sure the court sees you as a threat." The phrasing tightened my chest. Heather often said make sure people see when she wanted to control the story before anyone questioned it. Daniel sent another folder. "We need to report suspected exploitation of a minor. The bank may not tell you anything if you are not listed on the account." He was right. The representative would not confirm balances, ownership, or account authority. She accepted my complaint, gave me a case number, and said the pending transfer would be flagged for manual compliance review. Daniel filed his own report and uploaded his records. The transaction had not been erased or magically frozen. It had only stopped moving automatically while someone reviewed the complaint. At 9:18, after Lucy had fallen asleep on the sofa, Brian texted me, "Do not delete the family chat." I called him. He did not answer. At 10:47, Heather's name appeared on my screen. She shouted before I could speak, "How could you do this to your own family?" In the background, Scott asked why the transfer still showed pending review. Heather covered the phone, but I heard my father say they had to fix it before morning. I looked at Lucy sleeping beneath a blanket, Daniel's scanned birthday card beside her hand. "I haven't done anything yet," I said. "You knew nothing about that account." "I know Lucy's name is on a statement she was never supposed to see. That money supports the whole family. It belongs to a child." Heather's breath caught. When she spoke again, her voice had softened. "Close the complaint. Tell Daniel there has been a misunderstanding. We can discuss this privately tomorrow." "Why did you keep Chloe away from Lucy? This is bigger than a children's argument." "That is the first honest thing you have said tonight." Her control broke. "If you keep doing this, Lucy will lose the only family she has left." The warning struck an old place inside me. 8 years earlier, I had been told that asking questions would cost me my daughter. Now Heather was using the same fear to make me protect whatever was hidden behind that transfer. By 7 the next morning, the family group chat had turned my decision into a crime. Susan wrote first. She said the money had only been borrowed temporarily and that no one had taken anything from Lucy. Thomas followed with a message about loyalty, privacy, and the damage caused when family problems were handed to outsiders. Heather added that Pierce Family Events employed 12 people and that I was risking their jobs over a misunderstanding I had not bothered to discuss. Brian did not write anything. Scott sent one sentence saying everyone needed to calm down, then deleted it less than a minute later. I took screenshots before anything else disappeared. At the kitchen table, I created a folder on my laptop and named it Lucy Originals. Inside it, I made separate folders for bank images, Daniel's records, returned mail, emails, screenshots, and notes. I saved every file in its original format before making copies. I wrote down when each item arrived, who sent it, and what had happened before and after. My job in payroll had taught me that records became unreliable when people renamed them, forwarded them repeatedly, or mixed originals with edited copies. It had not made me an investigator. It had only taught me not to destroy the trail before someone qualified could examine it. That distinction forced me to face something I had avoided for years. I knew how wage withholding worked once an enforceable order reached an employer. I knew agencies could establish support and locate wages. What I had never had was an order to enforce. 8 years earlier, I had been recovering from surgery, sleeping in my parents' guest room, and measuring my independence in trips from the bed to the bathroom. Daniel and I were already unraveling. Susan told me he was preparing to take Lucy to Oregon. Heather showed me email and that appeared to confirm it. I had been afraid, that opening any formal case would give him a doorway back into Lucy's life and a way to take her from me. My family knew that fear and pressed on it until silence felt like protection. Later, when I was working again and could have asked questions, shame took over. Each passing year made it harder to admit that I had built my life around information I had never verified. At 8:15, Daniel asked if we could speak by video. I almost refused. Then I remembered Lucy asking whether her father knew her birthday, and I pressed accept. Daniel appeared in a narrow kitchen with beige cabinets and a refrigerator covered in service stickers. He wore a dark work shirt with his name stitched above one pocket. Before either of us spoke, a large brown dog pushed its nose into the camera, filled the entire screen, and licked the lens. Daniel pulled it back. "Sorry, this is Otis. He thinks every call is about him." Despite everything, I laughed once. He seems better prepared than either of us. That is because he has no sense of accountability. The smile disappeared from Daniel's face as quickly as it had come. He sat down and folded his hands on the table. He told me he worked as an industrial union HVAC controls specialist. Most of his income came from commercial systems, emergency calls, overtime, and an annual bonus. He did not own the company, and he did not live like a wealthy man. The kitchen behind him made that obvious. Then he shared his screen. The first deposit had been $20,000 when Lucy was 2. After that, he sent $1,100 each month, $6,000 from his yearly bonus, and additional amounts for birthdays, school expenses, and holidays. Those special deposits totaled $13,800. Over 8 years, he had contributed $187,400. "These were not court payments," he said. "We never had an order. I thought this was the arrangement you wanted." I stared at the spreadsheet. I never knew the account existed. Daniel opened the original UTMA packet. His name appeared as donor. Susan Pierce was listed as the sole custodian from the date the account was opened. He explained that Susan had told him I was still recovering and wanted her to manage the money temporarily. He believed the account belonged irrevocably to Lucy and that Susan would use it only for Lucy's education and needs. "She said you did not want your name connected to anything I funded," he said. "She said it would upset you and make the separation harder. Why did you keep sending everything through her for 8 years? His jaw tightened. "Because I was a coward in a respectable disguise. I told myself I was respecting your boundaries. Really, I was avoiding the chance that you would reject me directly." He opened an email chain. The messages came from an address built from my full name and birth year. They instructed him not to contact me, not to send gifts to the house, and not to approach Lucy. One warned that if he attempted direct contact, I would ask the court to treat him as unstable and restrict him permanently. The words sounded like Heather. Not because of one phrase, but because every sentence turned fear into a command and called control protection. Daniel did not ask me to excuse him. I should have verified the address. I should have hired a lawyer. I should have opened a formal case instead of trusting the person who claimed to stand between us. "Yes," I said. He nodded. "I know." After the call, I found Lucy eating cereal at the counter. She studied my face before asking, "Was that him?" "Yes." I spoke with Daniel. She traced the rim of her bowl with one finger. "Do I have to call him Dad now?" "No. You do not have to call him anything until you decide what feels right. You do not have to speak to him today either." Her next question came almost as a whisper. "Did he remember my birthday?" I thought of the returned envelopes, each one marked with a different year, and told her, "He remembered every year." Lucy looked down at her cereal. She did not cry, but her shoulders shifted as if she had been carrying something heavy and had not yet decided whether it was safe to put it down. At 10, I called Evelyn Hart, a lawyer whose practice focused on trusts, property held for minors, and fiduciary disputes. I paid for the initial consultation with my emergency savings. Daniel then sent the firm an emergency retainer directly. He did not send money to me or try to take control of the case. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When I finished, she explained that the UTMA account was Lucy's property. Susan's name as custodian gave her technical authority to manage and distribute funds, but not ownership. Every decision had to be for Lucy's benefit, and Susan could be required to provide a complete accounting. Being custodian is not permission to borrow from a child, Evelyn said. It is a fiduciary obligation. The current balance was $18,612. That meant $168,788 of principal had left the account. Daniel then forwarded 2 documents Susan had sent him the previous year. The first was titled Family Investment Acknowledgement. It stated that I approved using part of Lucy's funds in family business ventures. My name appeared at the bottom in a slanted signature that looked close enough to mine to make my stomach turn. I had never seen the document. The second was titled Family Investment Addendum. Daniel's real signature appeared on the final page. He admitted the signature was his, but said he remembered signing a short acknowledgement that Susan remained custodian, not an agreement authorizing business investments. Evelyn asked us not to accuse anyone publicly and not to alter, annotate, or combine the files. She wanted the original versions, complete email headers, and every available transmission record. Then she looked directly into the camera. If these signatures stand, she said, they will argue that both of you agreed. Evelyn did not allow the conversation to drift into accusations. Before noon, she sent preservation notices to Susan, Heather, Pierce Family Events, and the bank. The notices demanded that no one delete messages, alter emails, destroy accounting records, or move disputed assets while she prepared the emergency petition. She also gave me an instruction I had not expected. Do not go to your parents' house, she said. Do not enter the company office, and do not take anything from either location, even if you believe it belongs to Lucy. My mother may still have Daniel's letters. That does not give you permission to retrieve them yourself. We protect the evidence by using lawful process, not by creating a new argument about trespassing or missing documents. I understood the warning. Heather would gladly replace a financial question with a story about her unstable sister breaking into the family home. I had spent too long reacting inside the version of events she created. This time, I would not give her one. Brian contacted Evelyn shortly after the preservation notices were delivered. He still did not call me. According to Evelyn, Heather had ordered him to erase every family message that mentioned the barbecue, Lucy, or the word Bluebird. Brian managed the company's phones and shared cloud accounts, so Heather assumed he could make the conversations disappear. Instead, her demand finally frightened him enough to act. He exported the family group chat with its original timestamps, participant information, and available metadata. He sent the archive directly to Evelyn, rather than forwarding individual screenshots that could later be challenged as incomplete. Can I read it? I asked. Not yet, Evelyn said. I need to preserve the original export and review the scope before we start circulating copies. For now, the important fact is that it exists. Brian had spent years avoiding conflict by looking down at his phone. Now that same phone held a record Heather had tried to destroy. I returned to the photograph Chloe had given Lucy. The first time I looked at it, all I saw was my daughter's name and the scheduled transfer to Pierce Family Events. Now I enlarged the image and examined the edges. A pale blue tab appeared in the upper corner. Most of the label had been cut off, but one word remained visible: Bluebird. I remembered Ben running across the patio with the plastic bird in his hand. Chloe said Bluebird is not a game. It was a file, I said. Lucy sat across from me at the kitchen table, coloring beside the leaning cake. We had brought it home unopened, and one side had sunk lower overnight. She looked at the enlarged photograph on my screen. So it is like a treasure map? Not exactly. The boring kind of treasure map? That is probably the most accurate description. She returned to her drawing, apparently satisfied that adults had once again made something important far less interesting than it needed to be. Heather called while I was photographing the original note under Evelyn's instructions. This time, she did not shout. Her voice was warm and careful, the way it became when anger had failed and she needed kindness to perform a job. Sam, I barely slept. I hate what this is doing to everyone. What is it doing to Lucy? That is exactly why I am calling. She should not be dragged into financial issues she cannot understand. She was already dragged into them. Chloe gave her the statement. Heather paused. Chloe had no right to take that. Why did an 11-year-old believe Lucy needed to see it? She overheard adults discussing something private. Children misunderstand. I looked at the word bluebird on the corner of the photograph. Then explain it correctly. Heather exhaled as if she had been waiting for permission to be reasonable. The account was never emptied for personal spending. The money was invested into Pierce family events. That company paid for family trips, celebrations, meals, and things Lucy benefited from. Mom believed keeping the business healthy protected all of us. Lucy's money paid for family barbecues? That is not what I said. It is the first example you gave. Heather ignored that. I can arrange $20,000 immediately, more than Daniel's original deposit. You close the complaint. Tell him there was a misunderstanding, and Evelyn does not file anything. The offer came too quickly. No accounting, no explanation, only a round number in exchange for silence. Why would you offer $20,000 if no one did anything wrong? I am trying to end this before legal fees consume everything. You also want me not to tell Daniel. He has already filled your head with his version. His version came with 8 years of deposits. Heather's sweetness thinned. Daniel was unstable. You knew that. You asked us to keep him away from Lucy because you were terrified he would use money to force himself back into her life. I remember you telling me that was what he intended. You were recovering. Your memory of that time is not perfect. There it was, the gentle removal of my own authority. She did not deny the past. She only suggested I was too damaged to remember it correctly. What happened to his letters? We protected you from a man who chose work over his child. He sent a birthday card every year. A card does not make someone a father. Neither did hiding one make someone a protector. After the call, Heather emailed a document titled Family Investment Addendum. It contained language stating that funds held for Lucy could be used to support family-controlled ventures. Near the bottom was the phrase, per DB, followed by Daniel's signature. The notary block appeared complete. It carried a seal, a commission number, and a date from 8 years earlier. I forwarded the original attachment to Evelyn without opening it in an editing program. Daniel joined our call 20 minutes later. That is my signature, he said. My stomach tightened. You told us you never agreed to an investment. I didn't. The document says you did. Daniel leaned closer to his screen. I remember signing one form at Susan's kitchen table when the account was opened. She said it confirmed she would manage the money while Samantha recovered. Was it notarized? There was a notary there, a woman from the bank, or one of Susan's friends. I do not remember her name. The certainty I had felt that morning weakened. Daniel had already admitted avoiding direct contact. Now, a real signature and a formal notary block connected him to the exact arrangement he denied. What else did you sign? I asked. One form. How can you be sure? Because I read it. It named Susan as custodian. It did not mention Pierce family events, loans, or family investments. He sounded sincere, but sincerity was not proof. For the first time since he answered my call, I wondered whether Daniel had hidden part of the truth to make his failure look smaller. Evelyn did not defend him. We verify documents. We do not decide based on who sounds most convincing. She asked Daniel to locate every file from the original account opening, including scans, emails, and any packet sent by the bank. She requested the addendum's original transmission data from Heather and added it to the preservation demand. Then I told her about Chloe. I wanted to contact the child directly and ask what she had seen. Evelyn stopped me. You cannot place Chloe in the middle of an adult dispute. Contact the school through the appropriate channel and request an emotional safety check. Do not ask staff to investigate your financial case. Tell them only that Chloe may be frightened because of conflict at home. I called the school counselor and explained that Chloe had secretly passed financial information to Lucy, appeared distressed at the barbecue, and might be afraid of an adult's reaction. I did not ask the counselor to question her about Bluebird. I asked only that someone safe make sure she was all right. That evening, Evelyn called after reviewing the addendum at a preliminary level. The notary block appears authentic in origin, she said. Daniel's signature also appears consistent with known examples. My mouth went dry. Then Evelyn continued. That proves a real notary block and a real signature exist. It does not yet prove they originally belonged to the text on page 2. Daniel stared at the document on his screen. I signed one form 8 years ago, he said. I never signed this. The next morning, Evelyn introduced us to Diane Mercer, a forensic accountant with a CPA license and a fraud examiner credential. Daniel paid the initial retainer directly to Evelyn's firm, just as he had paid the legal retainer. Diane made it clear that money did not buy him control over her work. My assignment is narrow, she said. I am tracing Lucy's UTMA account and the 3 largest recipients. I am not investigating every company, charity, tax return, or family member unless the records give us a reason. That limitation reassured me. I did not need someone to announce that my entire family was corrupt. I needed someone to tell me what had happened to my daughter's money and prove it in a way that could survive questions. The bank did not hand documents to me because I was Lucy's mother, and it did not answer Daniel because he had funded the account. Evelyn used the legal process available in the emergency case, and the bank produced the account opening packet, signature cards, transaction history, disbursement requests, and internal scans tied to the disputed records. The original packet settled the first question. Daniel was the donor. Susan had been named the sole custodian on the day the account was opened. There had never been a later transfer of custodianship because there was nothing to transfer. Susan had controlled the account from the beginning. Diane placed the original packet beside the family investment addendum Heather had sent us. At first glance, Daniel's signature page looked convincing because the signature was real. The notary block was real too. What failed was everything around them. The original account packet used a footer with the bank's old legal name. The addendum used a newer footer introduced years later. The signature page had been scanned at a lower resolution than the page before it. The page numbering jumped from page 1 of 2 to a sheet with no matching sequence. The file metadata showed the addendum had been created years after Daniel signed the account opening form. Heather had not forged Daniel's hand. She had used something better. She had taken a genuine signature and placed it beneath words he had never approved. Daniel stared at the comparison for a long time. So I was telling the truth. About this document, Evelyn said. That does not erase the choices you made afterward. He nodded without resisting. I should have contacted Samantha directly. I should have opened a parentage case, formalized support, and requested accountings. I let fear of rejection become an excuse for doing nothing. No one comforted him. That was one reason I believed his remorse. He was not performing it in exchange for forgiveness. Diane turned to the family investment acknowledgement, carrying my signature. My name looked more convincing than Daniel's, because it had been copied cleanly, without a visible break in the line. Diane asked whether Heather had ever possessed a signed medical document from me. I remembered the months after my surgery. Heather had kept a consent form allowing her to take Lucy to urgent care if I could not go. I found a scanned copy in an old email. Diane enlarged both signatures. The tiny hesitation before the P in Pierce was identical. So was a faint mark beneath the final letter where my pen had touched the paper twice. The signatures were not merely similar. They were the same image. The annual accounting statements contained copies from the same source. Heather had resized the signature slightly on some pages and darkened it on others, but the proportions and imperfections did not change. These documents did not authorize the bank to release funds, Diane explained. Susan already had the technical authority to make disbursements as custodian. These were created afterward to make it appear that Samantha reviewed and accepted what had been done. The distinction mattered. Susan had moved the money. Heather had directed where it went and built the paper shield meant to protect them if anyone asked questions later. My mother had not been tricked by a sophisticated banking scheme. She had used the authority Daniel trusted her with, then called the withdrawals family decisions. That afternoon, Susan sent a message through Evelyn. She described the first disbursement as a temporary family loan made during a difficult business season. She insisted every dollar had preserved jobs and would eventually be repaid. Lucy was doing homework at the other end of the table when I repeated the phrase under my breath. "Temporary family loan," she said. "Is that the long, grown-up way to say stealing?" I looked at her math worksheet, where every answer had to fit inside a small square. Sometimes adults use long words because the short ones make them ashamed. She considered that, then returned to her fractions. "That sounds inefficient." The comment made me smile, but the feeling did not last. Diane had built a timeline using the bank ledger, Daniel's deposits, my old messages, and the company records produced so far. She found the first withdrawal from Lucy's account. It happened 3 days after Susan told me Daniel had stopped supporting his daughter. I remembered that conversation clearly. I had been sitting at my parents' kitchen table with a heating pad against my abdomen. Susan held my hand and said Daniel had chosen a new life. Heather stood behind her and told me I needed to stop waiting for money that would never come. 3 days later, Susan authorized the first transfer out of an account Daniel was still funding. The lie and the withdrawals had begun together. Diane continued down the ledger. Payments went to Pierce Family Events, a vendor controlled by Scott, and an account labeled Family Table Initiative. The FTI transfers were smaller at first, then repeated with increasing frequency. When Evelyn asked Heather to identify FTI, Heather answered through her lawyer that it was a separate charitable organization and had no relevance to the UTMA dispute. Diane did not speculate. She added the payments to the reconciliation and kept working. By the end of the week, the numbers were no longer estimates drawn from Daniel's personal records. The bank statements confirmed that $187,400 had entered Lucy's account. $18,612 remained. $168,788 in principal had been transferred out. Diane then calculated lost growth, unsupported management charges, tracing expenses, and the preliminary costs required to recover the assets. The temporary civil claim reached $214,730. "This is not a final judgment," she warned. "It is a supportable working claim based on what we can document today." I looked at the figures and felt less shock than I expected. Numbers were almost merciful. They did not tell me that I had imagined 8 years of abandonment. They only showed when money entered, when it left, and who had benefited. Daniel had been cleared of approving the family investment, but not of abandoning his responsibility to verify what was happening. Susan's authority as custodian explained how the transfers occurred, but not why she believed Lucy's property belonged to everyone. Heather's copied signatures explained the cover story, but not why she had needed an entire file named Bluebird. Diane opened the final section of her reconciliation. "There's one more pattern," she said. "Family Table Initiative did not only receive money from Lucy's UTMA." She turned the screen toward us. "It also paid dozens of invoices submitted by Pierce Family Events. The invoices from Family Table Initiative changed the question Evelyn wanted answered. Until then, the case had been about money taken from Lucy's account and the documents created to hide it. Now a charity was paying Pierce Family Events, while the same family business received money from Lucy's UTMA. Diane needed records. Evelyn needed admissions preserved before anyone changed their story again. Susan asked us to meet at my parents' house on Sunday afternoon, She called it a family conversation, but Evelyn refused to let it become another room where 5 people remembered events one way, and I was told my memory was defective. Lucy did not come with me. I left her somewhere safe with instructions that I would call when I was on my way home. She knew the meeting concerned the account, but I did not tell her that the adults who had excluded her were about to explain why they believed they had the right to use her money. Evelyn joined by video from her office. Her face appeared on a laptop at the end of the dining table. Before anyone spoke, she confirmed that everyone consented to the meeting being recorded. Heather objected to the word recorded until Evelyn reminded her that she had requested the meeting. Daniel joined from Oregon for the first part. He sat in the same plain kitchen where I had first seen him, but he kept his camera angled away from the dog and spoke only when Evelyn asked him a direct question. Susan had arranged the table as if presentation could restore authority. Water glasses stood at every place. A yellow legal pad lay before Thomas. Heather had brought a binder thick enough to suggest preparation rather than innocence. She opened it without greeting me. "I made a benefit chart," she said. "Since everyone keeps using the word stolen, I thought we should look at what Lucy actually received." The first page listed family vacations, birthday parties, holiday meals, school contributions, and what Heather called shared enrichment. Beside each item was a dollar amount and a percentage assigned to Lucy. A beach house rental from 3 years earlier had been divided among 11 family members. Lucy's benefit was listed as $900. The annual barbecue included tents, catering supplies, lawn games, and photography. Heather assigned Lucy $480 for attending. The cake she had brought and never been allowed to serve did not appear on the chart. Heather turned another page. Pierce family events paid for experiences Samantha could not always afford. Lucy attended family trips, used equipment purchased by the company, and benefited from the stability the business provided. I studied the columns. Did Lucy agree to buy those things? She was a child. That is exactly the problem. Thomas tapped his pen against the pad. "The business feeds this family. It paid your mother and me. It employed Brian. It helped with school costs and emergencies. You are treating it like some stranger took the money. A child's account is not the family emergency fund." Susan pressed both palms to the table. "We were trying to protect you. Daniel chose work in another state. You were recovering, frightened, and barely functioning. We kept things stable when he did not." Daniel leaned toward his camera. "I sent money every month." "You sent money instead of showing up," Susan replied. His face tightened, but he did not argue that the money excused him. "I should have pursued direct contact. I have said that. It still did not give you the right to tell Samantha I sent nothing." Susan looked at me. "You were finally beginning to heal. Every letter reopened the wound. The first time one arrived, you cried for 2 days. I never saw a letter. I saw what his name did to you. So you decided for me. I made a decision as your mother. You made a decision as the custodian of Lucy's money, then hid it from Lucy's mother." Heather slid the chart toward me. "No one hid benefits from Lucy. This family provided her with more than Daniel ever did emotionally." I pushed the binder back. "Why should a 10-year-old pay for the choices of adults who wanted vacations, parties, and a business reserve?" No one answered immediately. Scott sat beside Heather, with his hands clasped between his knees. He had avoided my eyes since I arrived. Evelyn asked whether he knew Pierce Family Events had received funds that originated in Lucy's UTMA. "I knew the company had a reserve account," he said. "Heather handled the bookkeeping. I did not know Lucy's name was attached to it." "You invoiced Family Table Initiative through your vendor company," Evelyn said. "For legitimate event work." That was not my question. Scott rubbed his jaw. "I knew money moved between the organizations. I did not know it came from a child's account." I looked at him. "Did you ever ask where the reserve came from?" "Heather said it was family capital, and you decided not to ask what that meant." "I trusted my wife. Not asking was still a choice." Heather turned on him. Do not let her rewrite this as if you were involved. Scott flinched, and for the first time I understood that their unity depended on no one examining which facts each person had chosen not to know. Brian had been silent near the end of the table. His phone rested face down before him. When Evelyn asked about the family group chat, he swallowed. I was in it, he said. I saw the messages before the barbecue. You watched Lucy sit alone, I said. Yes. Why did you say nothing? Because every time Heather and Mom decide something is for the family, anyone who objects becomes the problem. I told myself it was only for one afternoon. It was one afternoon for you. He looked down. I know. He explained that Heather had called after the bank flagged the transfer and ordered him to erase messages containing Lucy's name, Bluebird, the account, or the barbecue. He had exported the chat instead and sent it to Evelyn. I am not asking you to forgive me, he said. I waited until deleting evidence might make me personally responsible. That is not courage. Evelyn shared her screen. The exported conversation appeared with dates, names, and timestamps. 3 days before the barbecue, Heather had written, "Keep Lucy away from Chloe until after the audit." Susan replied that excluding one child would look cruel. Thomas suggested telling the cousins they needed separate activities. Then Heather sent the sentence that made the room narrow around me. Kids with dads play together. She will stop asking questions, and no one has to mention the money. Brian had responded with a thumbs up. My mother had written, "It is only for one day." The words Lucy had carried home like proof that she was incomplete had not come from another child. They had been drafted by adults, discussed for effectiveness, and approved because they believed shame would silence her faster upon an explanation. Heather closed her binder. That message is being taken out of context. What context makes it acceptable? I asked. The audit had nothing to do with Lucy. Chloe had been repeating things she overheard and frightening the other children. So you used Lucy's father to make her stop talking. I used language she would understand. I felt anger rise, but it was colder than the rage I had imagined. Heather had not lost her temper at the barbecue. She had executed a plan. Evelyn asked where the Bluebird records were stored. Heather said there was no Bluebird file, only a label Chloe must have invented. Susan agreed too quickly. Brian said he had seen the word in company task lists, but never handled the physical records. I turned to Thomas. What did Bluebird mean? He looked at Susan before answering. Nothing. It was an old filing code. For what? I do not remember. Heather said, Dad, stop answering questions you do not understand. Thomas's pen stopped tapping. I understand perfectly. The original letters are still in the blue file. Silence settled over the table. Susan turned toward him so sharply that her chair scraped the floor. Heather's face lost its practiced calm. Evelyn's voice came through the laptop. Mr. Pierce, do not move, destroy, or alter that file. The preservation demand already covers it. Thomas stared at the legal pad as if the sentence had escaped without him. I stood, but I did not move toward the hall or ask where the file was kept. Evelyn had warned me not to touch evidence in my parents' possession, and I would not give Heather a reason to claim I had taken or changed anything. I looked at every person around the table. If Bluebird disappears tonight, every person in this room will have to explain why. Thomas did not touch the Bluebird file after the meeting. Evelyn contacted his attorney that evening, added the file to the pending production request, and arranged for it to be sealed, inventoried, and delivered through counsel. I never entered my parents' house or handled the box before it reached Evelyn's office. 3 days later, she called me in. The file was thicker than the photograph had suggested. Its blue cover had faded around the edges, and Thomas had written Bluebird in black marker across the tab. Diane sat beside Evelyn with a scanner, an evidence log, and a pair of thin gloves. Every page was numbered before anyone began reading. The first section held Daniel's letters. Some envelopes had never been opened. Others had been opened and placed back inside, with the flaps cut cleanly. There were postal receipts, return delivery slips, copies of emails sent from the false address using my name, and handwritten notes showing when Susan had told Daniel not to contact me directly. The letters did not make Daniel innocent. They made the lie larger. The cards formed a quiet record of the childhood he had watched from outside. One envelope contained a sheet of strawberry stickers because Lucy had once told Susan they made every notebook look less serious. Another held a pressed leaf from a park. Daniel said he hoped to show her someday. None of it replaced his presence, but none of it resembled a man who had forgotten she existed. In one birthday card, he wrote that he had seen a photograph of Lucy holding a papier-mâché planet at the school science night. In another, he asked whether she still hated peas but loved strawberries. He knew she had broken her wrist at 7 because Susan had mentioned it in an email, then told him that Lucy did not want a call. He had followed the edges of her life through public school posts, photographs sent by my mother, and the rare scraps of information she chose to give him. He had kept writing, but he had accepted every blocked path instead of finding a lawful, direct one. He loved her from a safe distance, I said. Evelyn closed one envelope. Distance can be understandable. 8 years without verification was still a choice. The next section contained the machinery used to support that choice. Printed emails warned Daniel that contact would destabilize Lucy. Copies sent to me portrayed him as threatening custody action. A calendar tracked his deposits beside withdrawals from the UTMA. Annual accounting statements carried the duplicated image of my signature. An audit checklist listed documents that needed to match before a review of Family Table Initiative. Near the bottom of that checklist, someone had written, "Keep LP consistent." I asked whether LP meant Lucy Pierce. Diane did not answer until she reached the supporting records. The initials, age, family circumstances, and dates all correspond. We can say the profile appears to be based on Lucy. We should not claim more than the documents establish. That afternoon, Renee Walsh met separately with Chloe and Ben. She was not my investigator, and the children were not questioned about bank law or asked to interpret adult documents. Renee spoke with them about what they had seen, what they had heard, and whether anyone had frightened them. I received only a protected summary. Renee did not give me recordings or turn the children's words into material for our lawsuit. She documented the safety concerns, preserved what was appropriate, and made clear that any further formal interview would occur through the correct process. Chloe said she found the Bluebird file in her grandfather's home office while looking for blue construction paper. She recognized Lucy's photograph clipped to a page and saw a bank statement with Lucy's name. Later, she heard Heather speaking to Susan near the laundry room. "We only need Lucy quiet until the audit clears," Heather had said. Chloe did not understand the audit. She understood her mother sounded scared and that the adults did not want Lucy asking questions. She copied the phone number and photographed the statement because she thought Lucy deserved to know her father had sent something. Ben remembered less, but one phrase had stayed with him. He heard the adults call Bluebird the sad girl case. He thought it was a school project and asked Chloe whether they were supposed to make a poster. When Renee's summary reached me, I sat beside Lucy on the sofa. I told her Chloe and Ben were safe and had spoken to an adult whose job was to protect children from being pulled into grown-up fights. "Is Chloe in trouble for taking the picture?" she asked. "No. She saw something that frightened her and asked for help." Lucy drew her knees toward her chest. "Grandma still loves me, right?" The question hurt more than the numbers. I wanted to give her an answer that restored the grandmother she thought she knew, but reassurance built on another lie would only repeat the harm. "I believe she loves you," I said. "Adults can love children and still make selfish or cowardly choices. Love does not make the choice acceptable. Do I have to forgive her?" "No. You do not have to decide anything today. Forgiveness is not a bill that adults get to hand to children." That evening, Lucy agreed to a short video call with Daniel. I stayed beside her, but I did not introduce him as Dad or ask her to perform happiness for either of us. Daniel appeared on screen, opened his mouth, and immediately disappeared behind Otis, the brown dog who shoved his face into the camera. For several seconds, all we could see was one enormous eye, a wet nose, and part of a tongue. Daniel tried to pull him back. "He has been waiting beside the laptop for 20 minutes. Lucy looked at the screen. "He seems better prepared than you." Daniel laughed, and I did too. The sound surprised all three of us, but it loosened something in the room. When Otis finally settled, Daniel spoke carefully. "I am sorry, Lucy. People kept things from me, but I also let them. I should have found a better way to make sure you were safe and knew I cared. That part is mine." Lucy did not tell him it was fine. She studied his face and asked, "Did you keep copies of the cards?" "Everyone. Can I see them without having to answer questions?" "Yes. You can read them, close them, throw them away, or ask me about them later." She nodded once. "Send the strawberry one first." After the call, I returned to Evelyn's office to review the last section of Bluebird. It contained an application for a charitable grant submitted by Family Table Initiative. The featured case was identified only as LP, age 7. The description said her father had abandoned her, provided no paternal support, and left her mother dependent on relatives for food, school supplies, and family inclusion. The application used details from Lucy's life: her age, my surgery, the period we lived with my parents, and even her science project appeared in the narrative. Moments I remembered as private weakness had been rearranged into evidence of a father's abandonment. Heather had signed the certification declaring the information accurate. The date mattered. Heather signed it 1 month after Daniel deposited $15,000 into Lucy's UTMA. She could not have believed there was no paternal support. The Bluebird calendar recorded the deposit, and her audit checklist referenced the same statement. I turned the remaining pages slowly. There were additional grant summaries, award notices, donor reports, and case studies describing children supposedly abandoned by fathers. The names were reduced to initials, but the emotional language repeated like a formula. On the final sheet, Diane had totaled the awards connected to those applications. Family Table Initiative had received more than $300,000. Beneath that figure was its vendor list. Pierce Family Events was the largest recipient. Evelyn would not let Diane follow the charity money, simply because the pattern looked suspicious. She first amended the scope of the accounting work, obtained the records through the proper process, and documented why the expansion was necessary. Daniel continued paying the initial professional fees directly to the firm. Evelyn added those costs to the civil claim rather than treating his money as a favor I owed him for. When the new records arrived, Diane built 3 columns across a wide monitor. The first showed grants received by Family Table Initiative. The second showed invoices submitted by Pierce Family Events. The third showed where the money went after the family company was paid. FTI had presented Lucy's story as its model case. In donor reports, LP was the abandoned child whose mother needed relatives to provide meals, school supplies, social inclusion, and emotional stability. The reports claimed that FTI had turned that private rescue into a program for other fatherless children. The program looked impressive on paper. Pierce Family Events billed the charity for weekend workshops, family picnics, mentoring sessions, printed materials, and media campaigns. The prices were far above what comparable vendors charged. The attendance records were worse. One Saturday workshop supposedly served 84 families at a community hall that held 50 people. The hall's rental calendar showed no FTI booking that day. A summer picnic listed 137 attendees, but the park permit covered a shelter with 6 tables. Several photographs submitted to different grant makers had been taken at the same event and cropped to look like separate programs. Some events appeared never to have happened at all. Diane traced grant money from FTI to Pierce Family Events, then onward to ordinary family expenses. Company payments covered Heather's credit card balances, part of Chloe's private school tuition, and a personal debt in Heather's name. Other transfers paid expenses that benefited Susan and Thomas, or kept the family company operating when it could not cover payroll on its own. The money had moved through enough accounts to look complicated, but its direction was simple. A charity raised money by describing children in pain. The family business invoiced the charity. Then the people controlling both organizations used the proceeds. Evelyn placed the first version of Lucy's case study beside a later grant application. The earliest draft was handwritten in Susan's familiar rounded script. She had described me recovering from surgery, Lucy missing her father, and our dependence on family meals. She wrote that Daniel had abandoned us and provided no support. In the margin, Susan added, "This is the story people understand." Heather had taken that first lie and professionalized it. She removed names, sharpened the language, added photographs and budgets, then repeated the model for years. What Susan had justified as one emotional appeal became a system that required the original story never to change. Daniel's return would not merely embarrass them. His deposit history would prove paternal support existed during the exact years FTI claimed there was none. If I learned about the account, I could challenge both the UTMA withdrawals and every grant narrative built around Lucy's supposed abandonment. The upcoming audit explained the panic at the barbecue. Heather knew Chloe had found Bluebird. She knew Lucy and Chloe trusted each other. If they compared what they had seen before the auditors finished reviewing FTI, the statement, letters, and false case study could connect. Kids with dads play together had been the final barrier between two children carrying different halves of the truth. That evening, I sat with Lucy at the kitchen table. I did not show her invoices or describe criminal allegations. I told her only what she had a right to understand. "Some adults used a story about you to ask people for money," I said. "They told people your father never helped and that our family had to rescue us." Lucy stared at the strawberry sticker Daniel had sent with his first scanned letter. "But I was sad." "Yes. So was the sad part fake?" I moved my chair closer. "Your pain was real. Their story about why you had it was the lie." She rubbed the edge of the sticker with her thumb. "Did they need me to stay sad?" The question exposed the whole scheme more clearly than Diane's charts. "They needed you not to learn the truth," I said. "That does not mean they owned your sadness. And it does not mean you have to keep it for them." Heather's lawyer sent Evelyn a settlement offer the next morning. Susan and Heather would restore the diverted UTMA principal through a payment plan secured by business assets. In return, I had to withdraw the request for expanded accounting, stop challenging FTI's grant records, and agree that the family investment documents resulted from misunderstanding rather than fraud. They offered to return Lucy's money only if I helped protect the method used to take it. Evelyn asked whether I wanted time to consider it. "No," I said. "If we close the FTI questions, they can keep using other children the way they use Lucy." The offer expired without a response from us. Evelyn then sent the FTI materials to the state charity regulator and the appropriate prosecutor's office. She did not promise charges or an arrest. She explained that investigators would decide whether the evidence supported a criminal case independently of our civil dispute. A state investigator interviewed one of the grant makers. The organization confirmed that its award depended on FTI's claim that the featured children lacked paternal support and that program funds would be used for actual services. Through formal requests, the investigator began obtaining bank and vendor records rather than relying only on copies supplied by our side. The UTMA case continued separately. Daniel also filed a parentage and parenting plan case. He asked the court to formalize his rights and obligations, establish direct support through lawful channels, and create gradual contact based on Lucy's comfort. His proposed plan began with letters and video calls, then short supported visits reviewed by a professional. Heather and Susan could not take custody of Lucy simply by objecting. Instead, they submitted affidavits in Daniel's case. They described him as unstable, accused him of using money to re-enter Lucy's life, and claimed I had become vulnerable to manipulation because of the financial dispute. Evelyn placed the filings side by side on her desk. The UTMA petition had one case number. It concerned accounting, removal of Susan as custodian, preservation of assets, and repayment. The parentage case had another. It concerned Daniel's legal status, support, and a safe parenting plan. One family had created both disputes, but the court would not pretend they were the same question. The scheduling notices arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The UTMA and accounting hearing was set for Tuesday morning. The temporary parenting plan hearing was set for Friday. I had barely finished entering both dates into my calendar when Evelyn's phone rang. She listened without interrupting, then wrote a sentence on her legal pad. After the call, she looked at me. The state investigator wants to know exactly when Heather will be at the courthouse. The investigator did not ask Evelyn to arrange anything. Heather already had 2 court dates, and her lawyer had filed notices confirming she would appear in person. Evelyn gave the investigator only the public scheduling information and the courthouse location. She did not discuss what the state intended to do. On Tuesday morning, I sat beside Evelyn in a courtroom that felt smaller than the dining room where my family had tried to justify using Lucy's money. Susan sat behind her attorney. Heather sat beside her with a binder open in front of her. Thomas and Scott waited in the second row. Brian sat farther back, alone. The judge began by defining the limits of the hearing. The court would address the UTMA account, Susan's duties as custodian, the request for a full accounting, the appointment of a successor custodian, and preservation of assets. The court would not decide parenting time, and it would not determine criminal guilt. Heather's attorney tried to frame the transfers as emergency decisions made to preserve the family business. Heather testified that Pierce Family Events had provided jobs, meals, celebrations, and support to relatives who would otherwise have struggled. She described herself as the person who kept the company alive, while I recovered and Daniel remained absent. Susan said the money had never truly left the family. She claimed Lucy benefited whenever the business paid for a vacation, a party, or a family meal. Evelyn asked one question. Was the UTMA account owned by the family? Susan lowered her eyes. It was for Lucy. Did Lucy own Pierce Family Events? No. Did Lucy authorize loans to it? She was a child. That is why the law appointed a custodian. The room became very still. Evelyn did not dramatize the evidence. She introduced it in the order it had been found. The original UTMA packet established Daniel as donor and Susan as sole custodian. The bank statements showed every contribution and withdrawal. Diane's document comparison showed that Daniel's genuine signature page had been attached to later language he never approved. My signature had been copied from an old medical consent and reused on annual accountings. Then came the family group chat, the Bluebird file, the letters, and the grant records already produced through lawful requests. No surprise witness entered. No secret recording appeared. The same evidence my family had spent years creating now sat in front of the court in chronological order. Diane explained the reconciliation without raising her voice. $187,400 entered the account. $18,612 remains. $168,788 in principal was transferred out. The current preliminary civil claim, including traceable loss, unsupported charges, and related recovery costs, is $214,730. Heather stared at Diane as if the precision itself were disloyal. When I testified, Evelyn did not ask me to summarize 8 years of pain. She asked what happened at the barbecue. I told the judge that my daughter had been made to sit alone while the adults repeated a rule they had discussed in advance. They used her missing father as a way to stop her from speaking with Chloe until an audit was finished. The money matters, I said. But what frightened me most was that they practiced a sentence designed to make a child ashamed of asking questions. They did not only hide records, they trained the family to keep the children away from the truth. Heather's attorney objected that I was turning a financial hearing into an emotional performance. The judge allowed the testimony only as it related to concealment and preservation of records. That limitation did not weaken it. It made the purpose clearer. At the end of the hearing, the judge removed Susan as custodian. A corporate fiduciary was appointed as successor custodian for the remaining UTMA assets. The court ordered a full accounting and issued a preliminary asset preservation injunction covering identified property and accounts connected to the disputed transfers. The judge did not declare Heather a criminal. She directed that records suggesting forgery or misuse be transmitted to the appropriate authorities and preserved my ability to seek attorney and accounting fees in a later ruling. Susan began crying before the clerk finished reading the order. Heather did not touch her. Outside the courtroom, Evelyn reminded me that no money had returned that morning. We had protected what remained and gained a lawful path toward recovery. That was not the same as restoration. Friday's hearing had a different case number and a different purpose. Daniel had filed the parentage and parenting plan action himself through counsel. Heather and Susan appeared only as witnesses who had submitted affidavits, claiming that renewed contact would endanger Lucy emotionally. The judge asked Daniel why he had waited 8 years. He could have blamed the false emails, my family, or the hidden letters. Instead, he said, I believed what I was told because it allowed me to avoid the possibility that Samantha and Lucy would reject me directly. I sent money and letters, but I did not use the legal system to confirm they arrived. I did not establish parentage, support, or parenting time. That failure belongs to me. The honesty did not erase the absence. It made the court less likely to believe he was pretending it never happened. Renee summarized Lucy's needs. She said Lucy wanted the opportunity to know Daniel, but she did not want to be removed from my care, pressured into visits, or required to call him Dad before she was ready. She wanted letters sent directly, video calls she could end when overwhelmed, and enough time to decide what relationship felt safe. Heather's affidavit described Daniel as manipulative and unstable. Susan repeated that his money had always been a method of control. Their lawyers produced no current threat, no violent incident, and no evidence that the short video calls had harmed Lucy. The judge denied the request for an emergency restriction. Instead, the court established a gradual plan. Daniel could send letters directly through a documented channel. Video calls would continue at agreed times. A short supported visit would be scheduled after preparation with a professional, followed by review in several months. Formal support would now move through lawful channels rather than relatives. I did not feel that I had defeated Daniel. The order did not reward him or punish me. It gave Lucy a way to learn the truth without being rushed, transferred, or made responsible for adult regret. When the hearing ended, Daniel stopped several feet from me in the hallway. Thank you for not making her choose, he said. She should never have been the one choosing between our mistakes. He nodded, then left with his lawyer. Heather emerged a few minutes later. 2 investigators were waiting near the security desk with a uniformed officer. One investigator identified her, confirmed the warrant, and asked her to place her hands where they could be seen. For the first time, Heather looked genuinely confused. She turned toward the courtroom doors as if the family judge could reverse what was happening. Evelyn stepped closer to me. This is the state case. It is separate from both hearings. Heather's lawyer demanded to see the warrant. The investigator showed it to him. The charges were not read as a final judgment, and no one announced a sentence. The state had obtained the warrant through its own investigation, using bank records, grantmaker interviews, and documents secured before that week. As the officer fastened the restraints, Heather saw me. "How could you do this to your own family?" she shouted. The same words had sounded powerful over the phone. In the courthouse hallway, they sounded like the only defense she had left. "I stopped you from doing it to mine," I said. They led her toward the elevator while Susan called her name and Thomas stood frozen beside the wall. Brian looked down, but this time there was no phone in his hands. I had won 2 limited orders that week. One protected Lucy's property, the other protected her right to know her father at a pace she could bear. Neither order returned 8 lost years, and Heather's arrest did not make her guilty before trial. For the first time, however, My family could no longer decide which truth counted by taking a vote. 10 months after Heather was taken from the courthouse, the criminal case ended without a dramatic trial. She accepted a plea agreement to state felony theft, forgery, and charitable fraud counts. The judge sentenced her to 30 months in prison, ordered restitution, imposed post-release probation, and barred her from serving as a fiduciary or officer of a charitable organization. The sentence did not return every dollar or erase what she had done to the children, but it took away the positions she had used to turn control into respectability. Susan accepted a lesser plea. Her age, cooperation after the warrants, and lack of prior convictions kept her out of prison, but the court imposed strict probation and restitution. She could not have private contact with Lucy unless I agreed, and the professional helping Lucy believed it was appropriate. My mother cried when the restriction was explained. She said she had never harmed Lucy physically and had only tried to hold the family together. I answered through counsel because I no longer attended meetings where guilt was renamed love. Thomas was not charged with creating the false records, but he remained responsible in the civil case for assets he had benefited from and records he had helped conceal. Pierce family events could not survive the accounting, repayment orders, and loss of trust. Parts of the company were sold, and the remaining contracts were transferred through a supervised restructuring, so employees who had not participated were not punished more than necessary. There was no single check that restored Lucy's account. Restitution arrived gradually from the sale of equipment, recovered funds, and scheduled payments. What remained in the UTMA stayed under the corporate successor custodian. Recovery proceeds were placed into a court-approved blocked account and minor trust, where no relative could borrow against them or call them family capital. Scott cooperated with the state after Heather's arrest. He produced vendor records, returned the personal benefits investigators could trace, and separated his finances from hers. His lawyer often used the phrase lack of knowledge. At the final restitution hearing, Scott used different words. "I knew enough to ask," he said. "I chose not to, because the money made my life easier." That admission did not make him innocent, but it was the first honest sentence I had heard from him. Brian was not prosecuted. The investigators found no payment diverted directly to him, and his early export of the group chat preserved evidence Heather had ordered destroyed. Still, he lost his position when Pierce family events collapsed, and he lost the easy relationship he assumed he would always have with me. He asked to meet at a coffee shop several weeks after sentencing. I agreed because he had finally stopped asking our mother to speak for him. "I am sorry I stayed quiet," he said. I waited for him to continue. He looked down at his hands, then corrected himself. I watched Heather make Lucy sit alone. I knew the rule had been planned, and I let her believe everyone agreed she was less important. I sent the chat only after Heather asked me to delete it, and I became afraid for myself. That is what I am sorry for. It was a real apology, because it named the act, the victim, and the selfishness behind his delay. "I believe you," I said. "That does not mean we go back to how things were." I know. For once, he did not ask me to make the boundary more comfortable for him. Daniel kept every promise in the temporary parenting plan, including the small ones no court could force him to keep. His letters arrived on the days he said they would. He did not send expensive gifts to manufacture affection. He mailed photographs of Otis, short descriptions of his work, and one terrible drawing of a strawberry that Lucy kept because it looked like a red potato with leaves. Their video calls remained brief at first. Lucy sometimes spoke for 20 minutes, and sometimes ended after 5. Daniel never asked why she was distant or reminded her how much money he had sent. When she finally met him in person, the visit lasted 2 hours at a family center with a professional nearby. He brought no speech. He brought Otis and a small box containing copies of the birthday cards, arranged by year. Lucy opened the strawberry card first. "On the drive home," she said, "he talks too much when he is nervous. So do you. That is different. I am interesting." I smiled. "Of course. Daniel and I did not become a couple again. We became two adults who had failed each other in different ways, and agreed that Lucy would no longer pay for either failure. Trust returned as documentation, punctual calls, honest answers, and choices repeated long enough to become dependable. I did not reconcile with the entire Pierce family because sentencing ended. Susan sent letters through her therapist. Thomas asked whether we could have Thanksgiving together for the children. I said no. A holiday photograph was not evidence of healing. Lucy could decide later whether she wanted carefully supported contact with her grandparents. Until then, my responsibility was not to make their remorse feel complete. It was to protect her right to recover without being rushed into forgiveness. At the beginning of spring, Renee helped arrange a small picnic where Lucy could see Chloe and Ben. It was held in a public park, with adults the children trusted, and no speeches about bringing the family back together. The first few minutes were awkward. Ben carried a soccer ball but forgot to put it down. Chloe kept smoothing the same corner of the picnic blanket. Lucy stood beside me, holding a cake box with both hands. Then Chloe walked over. "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner," she said. "I knew Bluebird was bad, but I was scared Mom would know it was me." Lucy looked at her for a moment. Kids should not have to apologize for being scared of adults. Chloe's eyes filled, but she nodded. Ben finally dropped the soccer ball. It rolled into the cake box and made all three children jump. When Lucy lifted the lid, the new strawberry cake leaned slightly toward one corner. Chloe pointed at it. "Should we fix it?" Lucy examined the tilt with great seriousness. "No, crooked things can still be loved." Ben asked whether that meant he could have the largest slice, because his handwriting was crooked. Lucy told him that was not how the rule worked, and the argument that followed was ordinary enough to make my throat tighten. They ate cake, kicked the ball, and built a sign from a piece of cardboard Chloe had brought. The letters were uneven, because Ben insisted on painting the word safe, and used too much blue. "All safe kids can play here." They tied it to the low fence beside the picnic table. It was not a legal order or a perfect slogan. It was 3 children replacing a rule adults had used to separate them with one they could understand. I watched Lucy run toward Chloe and Ben without asking which fathers were present, which surnames matched, or who belonged in the photograph. For years, I had believed family meant earning a permanent place in a group that could vote me out whenever truth became inconvenient. I had mistaken access for love and endurance for loyalty. Family was not the people who always stood together in the picture. Family was the people who never asked a child to disappear so the picture could look complete.